Thunder in the Pacific, 5 battles that changed the course of World War II. At dawn on December 7, 1941, the aircraft carrier Akagi pitched gently in the North Pacific swells, her deck already crawling with activity. Above her, the winter stars were fading into a pearl gray sky as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge, binoculars pressed to his eyes. In 6 hours, the world would change forever. The age of the battleship, those grand dreadnoughts that had dominated the seas for centuries, was about to end, though few yet realized it. The Pacific Ocean, covering 1/3 of Earth's surface, was about to become the largest battlefield in human history. In the coming months and years, 2 great naval powers would clash in a series of encounters so vast they beggared description. Aircraft carriers dueling beyond the horizon, battleships exchanging broadsides in the dead of night, destroyers charging headlong at enemies 20 times their size. The fate of nations would hinge on the decisions of admirals, the skill of pilots, the courage of sailors, and sometimes, perhaps most crucially, on mere chance. This is the story of 5 battles that reshaped naval warfare forever. At Coral Sea, for the first time in history, fleets would fight without ever seeing each other. At Midway, 4 minutes of dive bombing would change the course of the war. In the iron-dark waters off Guadalcanal, destroyers and cruisers would grope through the night like blind giants, fighting at point-blank range. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot would demonstrate the devastating evolution of American naval air power. And at Leyte Gulf, in the largest naval battle ever fought, destroyer crews would face down the mightiest battleships ever built in a modern-day David versus Goliath. These battles would see the finest ships ever built sent to the bottom of the ocean, the deaths of thousands of brave men on both sides, and the rise of a new era in warfare. They would test the limits of human courage, technological innovation, and strategic genius. This is their story, a tale of thunder in the Pacific that still echoes today. Let us begin with the first of these epic clashes, when 2 fleets, groping through the warm waters of the Coral Sea, were about to make history. Chapter 1: The Battle of Coral Sea, when giants fought blind. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon squinted through his binoculars at the distant smudge on the horizon. From 11,000 feet above the Coral Sea, his SBD Dauntless dive bomber had spotted something that would change the course of naval history. "Carrier spotted," he radioed back to USS Lexington, his voice crackling through the static. "Enemy carriers!" But Dixon's elation would soon turn to confusion. The carrier was actually a tanker, and his misidentification would trigger the first carrier versus carrier battle in history. A revolutionary engagement where the opposing fleets would never glimpse each other's ships. The waters northeast of Australia churned with purpose that May morning in 1942. Japanese Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue's invasion force steamed south, its sights set on Port Moresby, the last Allied stronghold preventing Japan from isolating Australia. But American codebreakers had already unraveled Inoue's plans. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's Task Force 17 lurked nearby, ready to spring the trap. The battle opened like a chess match played by blindfolded grandmasters. American scout planes probed the vast expanse of ocean, while Japanese submarines slithered beneath the waves. The first blood was drawn not by carriers, but by land-based bombers, striking at the Japanese invasion force. The Japanese light carrier Shoho, caught alone, disappeared beneath the waves under a deluge of American bombs and torpedoes. "Scratch one flat top!" Dixon crowed triumphantly over his radio, a phrase that would become legendary in naval aviation. But the main event was yet to come. On May 8th, both sides launched massive strikes at almost exactly the same moment. Japanese D-3, A-Val dive bombers and B-5 N-Kate torpedo bombers droned south, while American SBD Dauntlesses and TBD Devastators flew north, the aircraft passing each other, unknowing, miles apart in the vast Pacific sky. The Japanese struck first. Their bombs found USS Lexington, Lady Lex, the pride of the American fleet. Despite desperate evasive maneuvers, she took 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs. Yet her crew fought back with remarkable efficiency, and for a few crucial hours it seemed she might survive. Meanwhile, American bombs cratered the flight deck of the carrier Shikaku, leaving her unable to launch aircraft. Her sister ship Zuikaku disappeared into a squall, emerging unscathed but with her air group devastated. The battle had reached a bloody stalemate. But the day wasn't over. Deep in the Lexington's hull, aviation fuel vapors had been silently spreading. At 12:47 p.m., they found an ignition source. The resulting explosion rocked the mighty carrier. Captain Frederick Sherman, his voice heavy with emotion, finally gave the order: abandon ship. As the crew slid down ropes into the warm Pacific waters, they watched their beloved Lady Lex slip beneath the waves, her guns firing until the very end. The Battle of Coral Sea would go into the books as a tactical victory for Japan, but a strategic triumph for the Allies. The invasion of Port Moresby was thwarted. More crucially, the damaged Shokaku and depleted Zuikaku would be absent from the decisive Battle of Midway a month later, an absence that would prove fatal to Japan's ambitions of Pacific dominance. But perhaps most importantly, Coral Sea had demonstrated a revolutionary truth. Aircraft carriers could now strike at ranges far beyond the horizon. The age of the battleship was over. Naval warfare would never be the same. As the survivors of Lexington were pulled aboard nearby destroyers, they couldn't know that their sacrifice had helped forge a new chapter in naval warfare. In just 4 weeks, another carrier battle would erupt near a tiny atoll called Midway, and this time, the fate of the Pacific would hang in the balance. Midway, the turning point in naval warfare. Joe Rushford hadn't slept in 48 hours. Hunched over his desk in the basement of Pearl Harbor's Building 1, dubbed the Dungeon, the eccentric codebreaker shuffled through intercepts in his bathrobe and slippers. His obsession with breaking the Japanese JN-25 code had led to this moment. AF is short of water, the false message had proclaimed across the Pacific. The Japanese had taken the bait, confirming Midway was their target. Now, everything hinged on whether Admiral Chester Nimitz would trust this disheveled cryptanalyst over his own intelligence officers in Washington. Dawn broke over Midway Atoll on June 4, 1942. Lieutenant Howard Ade's PBI patrol plane droned through the pearl gray sky. At 5:45, his voice crackled over the radio. Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320 degrees, distance 150 miles. The Japanese striking force had arrived. Admiral Nagumo, architect of the Pearl Harbor triumph, stood confidently on Akagi's bridge. His 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented the most powerful naval force ever assembled. He had no way of knowing that 3 American carriers lurked northeast of his position. Nimitz had trusted Rochefort. The first American attacks came in scattered waves, Midway-based bombers, torpedo planes, all swatted aside by Zero fighters. But these attacks forced Nagumo into a fateful decision. His hangars were full of armed aircraft ready to strike American ships if they appeared. Should he rearm them for a second strike on Midway? At 7:15, the order was given: rearm the bombers with land attack weapons. 20 minutes later, a scout plane reported American ships to the northeast. Nagumo reversed his order, then reversed again. The hangars of Japan's carriers became chaos of bombs, fuel lines, and scattered ammunition. Through this confusion, torpedo planes from USS Hornet appeared. Ensign George Gay's squadron, VT-8, pressed their attack without fighter cover, a suicide mission. One by one, they were knocked from the sky. Gay would be the sole survivor, watching the next phase of battle while floating in the Pacific. Then came Torpedo Squadron VT-6 from Enterprise. They too were decimated. Squadron VT-3 from Yorktown followed, led by Commander Lance Massey, only to meet the same fate. Not a single torpedo found its mark. But the low-level attacks had drawn down the Japanese combat air patrol. The skies above were now empty. At 10:20, Commander Wade McCluskey faced a pilot's worst nightmare. His dive bombers were running low on fuel, and his search pattern had found empty ocean. Then, by pure chance, he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing to catch up with its fleet. McCluskey banked to follow. The next 4 minutes would alter the course of World War II. 3 squadrons of American dive bombers appeared above the Japanese carriers as if materialized from thin air. Lieutenant Dick Best's bomber screamed down at Akagi. "I couldn't miss," he would later recall. "She was as big as New York." The first bomb pierced Akagi's flight deck and exploded among armed aircraft below. Within moments, Keiga and Soryu were also ablaze. Only Hiryu escaped the initial onslaught. Her counterstrike crippled USS Yorktown, but Enterprise and Hornet's bombers found her late that afternoon. By sunset, 4 Japanese carriers, the same ships that had brought devastation to Pearl Harbor, were burning hulks. Admiral Nagumo watched his once mighty fleet in ruins. On Akagi's tilting deck, sailors fought hopeless fires. In his cabin that night, he wrote, "I have no words to apologize for our complete defeat." The victory at Midway didn't just avenge Pearl Harbor, it shattered Japanese naval aviation. Over 2/3 of their veteran pilots were lost, along with their finest carriers. Japan would never recover this naval air power. More importantly, the victory validated a new kind of warfare, one where battles were decided by young pilots miles from their targets, guided by intelligence gathered by men in bathrobes thousands of miles away. But the Pacific War was far from over. In the Solomon Islands, a new kind of naval battle was about to unfold, one fought in darkness at point-blank range, where radar and intuition would mean the difference between survival and iron grave. Iron Bottom Sound, the Guadalcanal naval battles. Commander Harry Sims sat in his darkened bridge, straining to see through the inky blackness of the Solomon Islands night. His destroyer, USS Laffey, was leading a thin line of American warships through the Slot, a stretch of water soon to earn a more ominous name, Iron Bottom Sound. The date was November 13th, 1942. On Guadalcanal, Marines had been fighting for 3 months to hold Henderson Field, the airstrip that could determine the fate of the South Pacific. But tonight, something bigger was coming. American intelligence had warned that the Japanese were mounting a major bombardment operation to destroy the airfield. 2 Japanese battleships, the Hiei and Kirishima, were steaming down the Slot. Admiral Daniel Callahan faced an impossible choice. His force of light cruisers and destroyers was all that stood between the Japanese battleships and the vulnerable Marines on shore. Standard naval doctrine dictated that light forces should never engage battleships at night. But doctrine had never contemplated the desperate stakes of Guadalcanal. At 1:42, radar on the light cruiser USS Helena picked up contacts. The Japanese fleet, perfectly positioned for a bombardment run on Henderson Field, had no idea the Americans were there. But radar, still new to naval warfare, couldn't tell friend from foe in the jumble of ships about to collide. The 2 forces interpenetrated like shuffling cards. Commander Sims suddenly found Laffey alongside the battleship Hiei, so close he had to look up at a steep angle to see her bridge. "Open fire!" he bellowed. Laffey's 5-inch guns, designed to fight aircraft, blazed away at point-blank range at the battleship's superstructure. The night erupted in chaos. Ships fired at muzzle flashes, unsure if they were hitting friend or foe. The cruiser San Francisco, mistaking the Japanese battleship for a friendly vessel, flashed a recognition signal. The response was a devastating salvo from Hiei's 14-inch guns. Admiral Callahan's voice crackled over the radio from San Francisco's bridge. "We want the big ones. Get the big ones first." They were his last words. A shell from Hiei obliterated San Francisco's bridge, killing both him and Rear Admiral Norman Scott. But the Japanese were equally confused. Admiral Abe, stunned by the American ambush and the close-quarters melee, lost control of his formation. His carefully planned bombardment dissolved into a swirling knife fight. Destroyers launched torpedoes at shadow targets. Cruisers fired star shells that illuminated friend and foe alike in harsh white light. LT Commander Bruce McCandless, finding himself the senior surviving officer on the San Francisco's devastated bridge, took command of the shattered vessel. Despite grievous damage, he kept his ship in the fight, pounding away at the Japanese force. By dawn, both sides had withdrawn, leaving an ocean of burning oil and floating debris. The Japanese battleships, though damaged, had failed to bombard Henderson Field. But the cost had been astronomical. The waters of Iron Bottom Sound claimed 2 American light cruisers and 4 destroyers. Japanese losses were lighter, but crucially, Admiral Abe's bombardment mission had failed. 2 nights later, the Japanese tried again. This time, American radar-directed gunnery proved decisive. The battleship Kirishima, caught in a deadly crossfire from the USS Washington, capsized and sank. The lessons were clear. Night combat was no longer the exclusive domain of the Japanese Navy, and radar had changed the nature of naval warfare forever. The waters between Guadalcanal and Savo Island earned their grim nickname. By the campaign's end, nearly 50 ships would rest on the bottom, American, Japanese, and Australian alike. The Solomon Islands campaign marked the first time in history that battles were fought almost entirely at night, where technology and courage counted more than sheer firepower. But an even greater revolution in naval warfare was coming. In the Marianas, American naval aviation would demonstrate just how far it had come since the desperate days of Midway. The greatest carrier battle of the war was about to begin, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a pivotal WW2 battle. Alex Vrasiu crouched in his Hellcat's cockpit, sweat beading on his forehead in the Pacific sun. Below him, the American carriers of Task Force 58 looked like toy boats scattered across the vast ocean. Then his radio crackled. "Bogies bearing 035 Angels 20. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were inbound. June 19, 1944 was about to become the deadliest day in Japanese naval aviation history. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher stood on USS Lexington's flag bridge, knowing this battle would be different. His pilots now flew the F-6F Hellcat, a fighter specifically designed to outclass the Zero. His crews were battle-hardened veterans. His radar could detect incoming raids at unprecedented ranges. This was no longer the Navy of Coral Sea. The Japanese plan, dubbed Operation Ago, represented their last best hope to destroy America's fast carrier force. Admiral Ozawa commanded 9 carriers, but his secret weapon was supposed to be the land-based aircraft in the Marianas. He believed he could trap the Americans between hammer and anvil. What he didn't know was that American submarines had already spotted his force. More crucially, 2 days of American strikes had already destroyed most of those land-based aircraft. The anvil had crumbled before the hammer could fall. At 10:23, the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared on radar. Lieutenant Commander Paul Buey's Combat Air Patrol met them 70 miles out. They were like a swarm of bees, Buey would later recall, but we had the altitude, the speed, and the numbers. Vrasiu dove into the fray, his Hellcat's 6.50 caliber machine guns blazing. In minutes, he splashed 6 Japanese dive bombers. All around him, the sky was filled with burning aircraft. Japanese pilots, many with barely 20 hours of flight time, found themselves facing American veterans with hundreds of combat hours. The result was slaughter. The few Japanese aircraft that broke through met a wall of anti-aircraft fire. New proximity fuses made American flak deadly accurate. Ship crews, accustomed to counting individual kills, soon lost track. It was like swatting flies, one gunner recalled. By day's end, over 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. American losses: 23 planes, most lost to mechanical failures rather than combat. A sailor watching the carnage dubbed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But the battle wasn't over. As sunset approached, Ozawa's carriers had been spotted. Mitcher faced a crucial decision. His pilots had been flying all day. Launching a late strike meant they would return in darkness, something carriers had never attempted. But the chance to destroy the remaining Japanese carriers was too tempting. At 16:15, 216 American aircraft launched into the setting sun. They found Ozawa's fleet and sank the carrier Hio, while badly damaging 3 others. But now came the hard part, finding their way home in the dark. In what would become known as Mission into Darkness, Mitcher made an unprecedented call. "Turn on the lights," he ordered. Every ship in Task Force 58 illuminated itself, creating a lattice of light in the darkness, a beacon for their returning pilots, but also a perfect target for any lurking submarines. Aircraft began arriving at 20:45. Many were running on fumes. Pilots landed on any carrier they could find, protocol forgotten. Some ditched beside destroyers when fuel ran out. Through it all, Mitcher stood on the bridge, watching his pilots return. He remained there until the last plane was recovered at 22:30. The victory was total. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from this defeat. Of the 430 planes with which they had begun the battle, only 35 remained operational. More critically, their irreplaceable veteran pilots were gone. But even this devastating carrier battle would be overshadowed by what came next. In the Philippines, the largest naval battle in history was about to unfold, where destroyers would face down battleships, and one admiral's fateful decision would nearly lead to disaster. Leyte Gulf, the greatest naval battle in history. Ernest Evans, a Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma, stood before his crew during USS Johnston's commissioning ceremony in 1943. "This is going to be a fighting ship," he declared. "I intend to go in harm's way." Little did he know that on October 25, 1944, he would lead one of the most dramatic naval charges in history. The Japanese had staked everything on Operation Shogo, a complex plan to defend the Philippines with their remaining naval forces. Admiral Kurita's powerful center force, including the massive battleship Yamato with her 18-inch guns, would strike from the west. 2 smaller forces would serve as decoys, drawing the American carriers away from the vulnerable invasion beaches at Leyte Gulf. The trap was perfectly laid. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding the 3rd Fleet, took the bait. When the Japanese carrier force was spotted to the north, he charged after it with his entire fleet, including every available battleship. But the Japanese carriers were nearly empty of aircraft, stripped of their planes after the Marianas disaster. They were sacrificial lambs. That left only Taffy 3, a small task unit of 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers, between Kurita's battleships and the American invasion force. The morning of October 25th dawned with a shocking sight. On the horizon loomed the biggest battleships ever built, bearing down on ships designed to hunt submarines. Commander Evans didn't hesitate. The Johnston turned and charged straight at the Japanese fleet. "All hands to general quarters," he bellowed. "We're making a torpedo run." His destroyer accelerated to flank speed, zigzagging through shell splashes the size of apartment buildings. The Japanese were stunned. Surely this lone destroyer wasn't attacking their entire battle fleet. But Johnston's torpedoes struck home, hitting the heavy cruiser Kumano. As Johnston retreated behind a smokescreen, a shell from Yamato crashed through her engine room. Evans, his hand mangled by shrapnel, directed the damage control effort from his hip. Inspired by Johnston's charge, the other American escorts joined the fight. The destroyer Herman slalomed between salvos from 4 battleships. The Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort even smaller than Johnston, closed to point-blank range with the heavy cruiser Chokai. "We're so close I can see the expressions on the faces of the Japanese sailors," one gunner reported. Above the melee, escort carrier pilots pressed their attacks with whatever they had, even depth charges meant for submarines. Some, out of ammunition, made dry runs to draw fire away from their ships. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland of the Roberts broadcast to his crew, "We're making a fight for it. We want to do as much damage as we can." The Japanese, believing these suicidal attacks must be covering for approaching American battleships, began to hesitate. Shells that could have obliterated the small American ships passed overhead as their gunners overcompensated. The pressure of dozens of attacking ships, many of which were actually the same vessels circling back through their own smoke screens, began to tell. At 9/11, Kurita ordered a general withdrawal. The most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled had been turned back by a handful of destroyers and airplane pilots armed with depth charges. The cost was steep. Johnston, Roberts, and 2 escort carriers went down fighting. Commander Evans went down with his ship, still encouraging his men from the bridge. The Battle of Leyte Gulf marked the end of an era. Never again would battleships play a decisive role in naval warfare. The courage of Taffy 3's sailors had saved the invasion force, but more than that, they had written a new chapter in the annals of naval heroism. In the battle's aftermath, Samuel B. Roberts' survivors clung to life rafts. A passing destroyer asked what ship they were from. Back came the proud reply, Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. The Pacific War would rage on for another 10 months, but the Imperial Japanese Navy was finished as a fighting force. The 5 great battles had reshaped naval warfare forever, marking the ascendancy of aircraft carriers and the twilight of the battleship era. But perhaps more importantly, they had demonstrated that victory often hinged not on the size of the ship, but on the courage of the sailors who fought them. Legacy of naval warfare, a century's influence. On September 2, 1945, the battleship USS Missouri rode at anchor in Tokyo Bay. Above her towering deck, the very same skies that had once swarmed with Zeros were now filled with hundreds of American carrier aircraft. A final, silent testimony to the revolution in naval warfare that had unfolded across the Pacific. The 5 great battles had rewritten the rules of naval combat. But their impact would echo far beyond World War II, shaping conflicts for generations to come. In 1967, when the USS Forrestal launched aircraft over Vietnam, her pilots flew missions using tactics refined in the crucible of the Marianas Turkey Shoot. The importance of pilot training and superior aircraft lessons written in blood over the Pacific hadn't been forgotten. During the Falklands War in 1982, British carrier operations in heavy weather drew directly from Mitch's daring night recovery techniques, first attempted after the Turkey Shoot. The Royal Navy's official history would specifically credit those lessons for saving dozens of pilots. The advent of missile warfare seemed to change everything until the 1986 strike on Libya, when US carriers demonstrated that the fundamental principles of carrier warfare established at Midway remained valid. Surprise, deception, and concentrated air power could still defeat sophisticated defenses. But perhaps the most profound legacy lay in the realm of technology. The code-breaking triumphs that had enabled victory at Midway became the foundation for modern signals intelligence. The radar innovations born in the nightmare battles of Iron Bottom Sound evolved into the Aegis combat system protecting today's fleets. Even the desperate improvised coordination between ships at Leyte Gulf helped shape modern networked warfare. The human cost had been staggering. The waters of the Pacific had claimed over 200,000 sailors from all sides. Dozens of carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers lay scattered across the ocean floor, some still releasing oil, their black tears marking their graves even today. The survivors carried their memories forward. Joe Rochefort, the brilliant codebreaker of Midway, never sought recognition for his role. When finally awarded the Distinguished Service Medal in 1986, it had to be presented posthumously. Alex Vrasiu, the ace of the Turkey Shoot, spent decades teaching young pilots that technology alone doesn't win battles. Judgment and courage do. Ernest Evans' Medal of Honor citation hangs today in the Pentagon, reminding military planners that sometimes the most decisive factor in war is the unconquerable spirit of a single commander who refuses to back down against impossible odds. In the end, these 5 battles did more than determine the outcome of World War II. They charted the course of naval warfare for the next century. The carrier remained queen of the seas. Aircraft, submarines, and electronics became the arbiters of naval power. But most importantly, they proved that despite all technological advances, wars are still won by the skill, courage, and sacrifice of those who fight them. As modern warships patrol the Pacific today, their crews still pass over the deep waters where these battles were fought. Below them rest the silent hulks of once proud vessels, their guns still pointed defiantly at long vanquished foes. They are memorials not just to victory or defeat, but to a moment when the nature of naval warfare changed forever, where thunder echoed across the Pacific and the future was written on the waves.